Is it because at some level Jeffrey Epstein and his operation were being protected?
I haven't seen any evidence of that.
You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Tim Dillon, the other day, I believe this was at the end of last week, he had Maggie Haberman and Johnathan Swan on his podcast. These are two New York Times journalists. Maggie Haberman is very well known, and Johnathan Swan is as well. He was the one who went viral for the pictures where he's looking at Trump like he's crazy during COVID. And Haberman has been around for forever and was, for a while, kind of an enemy of Trump, but then became like the main reporter that follows Trump around, especially in Mar-a-Lago. I think during the intermediary period when he wasn't president and Biden was, she has worked her way into having some kind of mutual relationship with him, which is kind of how journalism works. And so the intricacies of that and the nuances of that somebody like Tim Dillon has kind of built a career off of ignoring is what makes a conversation like this interesting, and also what makes it so that two journalists like this are not really coming with what the audience that Tim Dillon has built up is looking for, even though they do say a lot of very interesting things in this interview. And I guess they're just marketing their book that they wrote about Trump and his decisions to go to this Iran war, etc. And they feel like Tim Dillon's audience is one that is looking for that message. But it just leads to some interesting exchanges in this interview. So here's him asking about some pretty developed theories that he has around Trump's assassination attempt, Epstein, and how these things tie in with Israel, and essentially is just trying to get them to have an interesting answer on that, but they have a bit of a different approach to the subject than he does. So here's that.
Tucker has floated the idea on his show that we don't fully understand, and even to me, it is a bit confusing. We don't know much about Thomas Matthew Crooks. We don't know much about the Butler assassination. There are people that believe that there are elements to it that may have been staged, may have been faked. It's just very interesting that after that assassination attempt, Trump and Netanyahu have this meeting, and Trump goes, I'm going to be more hawkish on Iran. Tucker has floated the idea, without directly, but I think he's kind of implied it, that Trump is afraid for his life. And that for whatever reason, after that assassination attempt, he became more amenable to certain ideas. And I think Tucker strongly implied that either Israel was behind the attempt, or Israel maybe knew about it, or whatever the situation may be. I mean, you're aware of that. Obviously, both of you are aware of that. It's Tucker Carlson is a massive figure in the party. Mm-hmm. What is your response to something like that? Whether it's that direct accusation or what about Trump changed after that assassination attempt? Did anything change? Was he more concerned with his own mortality? Why did the president of Israel fly to him directly after the assassination? Explain to me the dynamics of that aftermath.
Right. I don't see, firstly, I haven't seen any evidence to support what Tucker is saying on that, and I personally don't agree with it. I do think that the assassination attempt made Trump more fearful for his life. There's no question about that. I don't think there was any, I don't see any evidence that there was any Israeli connection to any of that.
Take us into that, that scandal that erupts over the administration's refusal to declassify those documents in the beginning, and then to also kind of gaslight their own supporters by saying nothing happened, because that was, from my estimation, the beginning of the end of the MAGA movement. Why would the president want it to disappear?
Without being able to know exactly, I mean, to be clear, Tim, in the reporting that we did, we didn't learn anything that would change anyone's understanding of what happened in terms of Epstein's crimes, Maxwell's crime, anything about Trump. We were really focused on the administration's reactions.
This question is for both of you. Have you seen any evidence to the, or whether it's circumstantial or not, do you believe that Jeffrey Epstein was affiliated with either our intelligence service or a foreign intelligence service? And is that one of the reasons that we have not seen the rest of the documents, or that it has, as Maggie said, it's a multi-administration failure? Is it because at some level Jeffrey Epstein and his operation were being protected?
I haven't seen any evidence of that. But his network was, extraordinary, and you've seen that in the documents. He's a very unusual network. But we've not seen anything that, we would need ironclad evidence to be able to say that he had some affiliation with an intelligence network, and we just haven't seen evidence. I haven't seen evidence that would make me feel confident saying that at all.
Yeah, so a couple things. There's points here that I more so agree with Tim Dillon on and think they're being a little overly sheepish, and there's also things that I think is kind of completely made up coming from the right. I think this thing about the Butler assassination attempt being faked by Israel or being staged by Israel because they wanted to put the fear in Trump. That's one of those things that there's just zero evidence for. There's some questions surrounding the kid Thomas Crooks for sure. And, we never got a lot of information on that. What they say in this interview is that there's more of a suspicion that that's tied to Iran, and that was part of the reason that Trump was motivated to go to war in Iran. So what Tim Dillon does here, and he does this a couple times, is he throws a bunch of questions out there because he's thought about this stuff a lot, and he goes out on his podcast every day and he just riffs on these theories and builds on them. And so he's trying to get them to answer to these things that make perfect logical sense to him. And in some cases, the dots connect closer than others. But he's asking them to affirm stuff that there's just no evidence on the books for, which, first of all, they're not going to do, because even if they have their suspicions about a certain thing, they're going to err more on the side of journalistic standards and whatever. But also, these are journalists who are working relatively closely to Trump, so they're not going to say something that is both untrue or unsubstantiatable and going to ruffle feathers with people that they need as sources. So that's part of why journalists come off a little bit untrustworthy in contexts like this. And the response that you see in the Tim Dillon audience to these type of answers is oh, well, we don't have evidence for that, of course. But that's true. That is how journalists think, as opposed to somebody like Tim Dillon. The job that he has created for himself is somebody who connects dots. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. Tim Dillon is a couple steps closer to reality than somebody like Alex Jones. But it's a similar practice that they do, where they are very used to painting a picture for their audience based on things that they see as evidence, things that they hear, conjecture, things that present themselves as stories in the news. And based on all this stuff, they kind of build out a worldview. And I'll give credit to Tim Dillon for even being willing to talk to journalists like this, because that's usually the part that they refuse to do, because in general they have decided that journalists like this are complete liars, they're completely captured, and journalists' inability to cover the ground of talking about these things that people are more interested in, like Epstein's connection to Israel, Trump's connection to Israel, and how they might be doing things in an underhanded way to influence Trump. That's stuff that people want to know more about, and journalists taking this type of approach don't have the ability to touch it because they're approaching things with a higher standard. But also they do have limits to what they can go after based on the institutions that they work for. So it's kind of this two-pronged problem. And in the case of Epstein being some kind of intelligence asset, I think there's more evidence for that. There's been reporting in DropSite that's close to that, more so just implying the intricacies of the ties that he had with different governments and government officials. That implies that he might have been used or had information that could be used towards intelligence means, possibly that he was some kind of broker or something, that he would provide information on a case-by-case basis. But they're just going off the fact that there's no actual proof of that has been produced. And Tim Dillon is hoping that in their access behind the scenes, they've seen something that the rest of us have not seen, and they say that they haven't. So the fact that that's boring and also reaffirms people's biases about institutions being unwilling to tell the truth about this kind of thing means that the Tim Dillons of the world, the Joe Rogans of the world, are going to be able to continue riding the gravy train by filling that space with a bunch of theories. But I think sometimes these right-wingers lose track of the fact that they are truly building an entire worldview based on kind of smoke and mirrors, sometimes little grains of truth here and there, and a lot of it falls apart on scrutiny. And another example of that was this conversation that Ezra Klein had with Christopher Rufo. I don't know why he had this conversation. He is hell-bent on talking to some of the worst faith figures on the right and also kind of lionizing them at least a little bit. I mean, he did that with Charlie Kirk after his death, and then seems to be wanting to talk to Christopher Rufo on the same pretense, like, you know, you're just a person, a warrior for the ideas you believe in, so let's exchange ideas. And the problem with that is that in doing so, maybe you can convince some people that agree with Chris Rufo, maybe, but you're just dealing with people that are much more hardened and hard-headed in their ignorance, purposeful ignorance, willing ignorance. And this is an interesting example because Rufo here is defending the way that the right goes about pushing certain narratives and using that to draw attention to things, as well as his own quote-unquote reporting about fraud in Minnesota related to Somalia, making these leaps and tying the fraud that is proven and was prosecuted to terrorist groups and accusations that are not as falsifiable, but then kind of trying to wiggle in between those things and say, well, I proved this, but what I'm claiming is actually this. Kind of a Mott and Bailey type thing that he's doing. But then he also has criticisms for Nick Shirley and feels that the type of quote-unquote citizen journalism that Nick Shirley does is like not legitimate or less legitimate. So even among these sort of muckrakers that you have on the right that are literally just stirring up bullshit, fake, or confabulated stories, you still have this guy Rufo, one of the architects of this style of misinformation or disinformation, complaining that the journalistic standards of somebody like Nick Shirley are not up to snuff. So here's him talking to Ezra Klein about that.
Maybe in Dayton, Ohio, there was somebody who wasn't Haitian.
Correct.
Who maybe somebody thought, but other people didn't think, had eaten a cat.
Somebody and other people is quite important.
People can read your piece. They can read the Drop Site News article. My view is that there's never been any hard evidence of that happening in the Haitian community in Springfield, Ohio. Like nobody has substantiated that, and nor have you.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
I haven't made that. And in fact, I've said, look, there's no evidence of this particular claim. We should be more careful. And I'm doing reporting in California right now that has stories that have a similar kind of, let's say, shock value. For example, we did a story on migrants from Mexico and Honduras who come to San Francisco and get free sex change surgeries from the California state Medi-Cal system. This is a kind of explosive story that is true, that represents, I think, a lot of these underlying questions about homelessness policy, about immigration, et cetera.
Your piece is actually quite careful, right? I've read the piece, I've read it carefully. And you're right, you don't allege that the point of this is to fund terrorists. Then when you sort of promote the piece, your tweet is, Somalis are stealing billions of dollars from American taxpayers and sending cash to terrorists back home. It's time for @real Donald Trump to revoke temporary protected status for all Somali nationals in the United States. It's time for them to go home. None of the people, as far as I can tell, were doing this were under temporary protected status, which is only about 750 people, right? So there's this move to say it's not just like some criminals, it's Somalis. And it's not just some money is being skimmed because of a weak banking sector, it's they're funding terrorism. And then it's to get Donald Trump to deport people who are unrelated to the crime.
Okay, so a couple points on that particular argument. So the point of the piece broadly, it raises the question of immigration, cultural compatibility.
But the people you're going with did not do this crime. Right? We agree on that part, right?
Hold on. Well, let me take it in pieces. So a couple of kind of factual problems here. You said a limited number of people committed these crimes. I'm actually not sure that that's true. I actually think you're getting the complicity or knowledge of actually a non-insignificant part of this community. Are most Somalis in Minnesota?
But you don't have proof of that.
I think it's just logical.
Nick Shirley gets in there, sees a building is empty, and then assumes, oh, they're committing $70 million of fraud or whatever. As a journalist, as someone who has to go through fact-checking, legal review, kind of peer scrutiny, I kind of clam up and I'm like, oh, wow, man, you're about to get sued because what you're saying is just not defensible as a journalistic process.
You know this video is not strong. Let's put it that way. That there's a lot. You can't go and be like, show me your kids. And when they don't show the kids, be like, this is a fraud. You don't have any kids.
There's an entire territory that is ceded to people. I don't even know if Nick Shirley is right wing. I'm not sure I would even categorize him as that. I think the story landed in that particular manner. But you have people, independent.
He's not left wing.
Let's say citizen journalists. I think that was the phrase for a while. There was great hope in the citizen journalist. Love citizens, love journalists. Citizen journalist is one of those things, like, it sounds good in theory, but in practice, there are some real limitations. And so it is what it is. What are you going to do about it?
As I said, Christopher Rufo is kind of one of the OGs of the current strain of conservatism at this moment. He's been a prominent voice on the far right for a long time and has focused a lot on internet culture and how to spread the message and, kind of focus on these reactionary narratives in a way that will get people interested in them. So that's why it's curious to me that he has issues with somebody like Nick Shirley or even Nick Fuentes. They talk a decent amount about Nick Fuentes here, and he doesn't seem to like Nick Fuentes because I guess Nick Fuentes goes too far into open racism or is just critical of Israel, and that's something that Chris Rufo doesn't like. That was also the source of tension between Charlie Kirk and Nick Fuentes, and they're able to pretty cleanly tie in the fact that Nick Fuentes opposes Israel with the fact that he is in fact quite racist about Jews and every other race, and make that their issue. This guy is racist, when really the only substantive policy they actually disagree on is Israel. Because when it comes to immigration, when it comes to other race-based policies, they are aligned with Nick Fuentes. That's why it's a little confusing to me that he has some type of issue with him, but I think it's purely optical, and it's purely the fact that they don't feel as in control of the audience of people and the cultural attention that Nick Fuentes and characters like him, even Nick Shirley, command. So somebody like Chris Rufo, who has spent a lot of energy trying to craft the current conservative reactionary narrative, feels like he's losing that to people that are actually less of institutionalists than he is, people like Fuentes who even want to tear apart the conservative institutions that Rufo has worked his whole life to create. So that's the source of tension there. And as far as this reporting goes, essentially Rufo is making the claim that because money left Minnesota and went to Somalia because Somalians were the ones committing this fraud, a certain portion of that goes towards an organization affiliated with the loosely controlled Somalian government because money goes through Somalia when people literally enter the country, like through fees. So that's his basis for saying that this is fraud that's funding terrorism, which is a claim that he has made very loudly. So he takes these very narrow claims that he's reporting on in print, and then he says things like, we need to deport all Somalians, or we need to end temporary protected status for Somalians, because when Ezra Klein presses him on it, now it's this cultural argument he's making. Now it's not the fact that we can actually prove all of this money is going towards terrorism, but rather the cultural argument that some of it must be, and he makes the argument that there was such a widespread network of fraud that thousands of people in the Somali community must have known about it, but he doesn't have any proof for that claim. And even when Ezra brings up the cats and dogs thing, Haitians eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio, Chris Rufo acknowledges that there was not proof that that was happening on a wide scale level. Even though he's still defending his claims about that, he acknowledges that there was no proof that that was something that was happening on a wide scale. Still happy to boost the story. And then again, when pressed about that, he says this thing about how I'm doing this story where immigrants from Honduras and Mexico are coming and getting free transgender surgeries in San Francisco. And so I looked into that, and literally all he's talking about is the Medi-Cal program in California, which does cover immigrants, doesn't question their status a whole lot, and includes transgender care. That's it. That's literally all there is. And this example he's talking about transgender people is literally one transgender person that he talked to on the street, Nick Shirley style, trying to drum up this like thing of, oh, there's immigrants and they're transgender, etc. So that's his version of this Nick Shirley style gonzo fake journalism because he has to depend on claims that he can substantiate at least a little bit. He's trying to hold himself to a certain standard, whereas somebody like Nick Shirley can just show you something that looks crazy, not really ask any other questions about it, come to some crazy conclusion about it, and move on. And the point that I'm trying to make is that whether it's Chris Rufo, Nick Shirley, or Tim Dillon, so much of what they take to be reality is just fold after fold after fold of these barely or completely unsubstantiated stories. And some of it turns out to be kind of true, most of it turns out to be not true at all. But people on the right, specifically, because of their lack of trust in institutional journalism, which has been stoked by people like Christopher Rufo, they are completely incapable of discerning when something that they take to be 100% reality is just something they've been told over and over again versus something that went through some kind of actual process of scrutiny. So good on Tim Dillon for actually talking to some real journalists, but I'm not counting on it that he is going to incorporate that into his programming going forward, if for no other reason than the facts and the verifications and the sources. It all kind of just gets in the way.
I'm in the pocket, and they know they can't slow it, can't stop shit. How the game so cold, so toxic, can't drop cause they're in somebody's pocket. For me that's not it.